On the night of January 4, 2022, 17-year-old Zion Foster walked out of her East Detroit home with a smile on her face and her whole life ahead of her. She'd just finished her shift at the Detroit Wing Company, pocketed her tips, and told her mother Sierra exactly where she was going. No secrets. No lies. Just a simple truth that Sierra had heard dozens of times before. She was spending the evening with her favorite cousin, Jaylen Brazier. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And for those of you who've been here with us, what time is it where you're watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious to know if you're watching this during your morning coffee, your lunch break, or late at night when you can't sleep. Sierra stood in the doorway and watched her eldest daughter climb into Jaylen's white sedan. It was a scene she'd witnessed at least twice a month for as long as she could remember. Jaylen would pull up to their driveway, give Sierra a warm hug, and whisk Zion away for a few hours of cousin time. Nothing unusual. Nothing to worry about. The 23-year-old was family, after all. He had 2 young sons of his own, a long-term girlfriend named Katrina, and a life that seemed stable and responsible. Sierra trusted him completely. But by 8:53 the next morning, everything had changed. Zion's boyfriend, Bertez Gonzalez, sent a frantic message to Sierra's phone. "Have you heard from Zion?" He hadn't been able to reach her all night. The last text he received came through at 12:59 a.m. It was just 3 letters, OMW. On my way. She never arrived. Every call after that went straight to voicemail. Every message sat undelivered, floating somewhere in digital space with no one on the other end to read them. Sierra's stomach dropped. She immediately reached out to Jaylen, expecting him to tell her that Zion had fallen asleep on his couch or that her phone had died. Instead, his response made her blood run cold. He claimed he hadn't seen Zion in years. Not months. Years. He insisted that whatever her daughter had told her was a lie, and that Zion had been using him as a cover story to see someone else. The same cousin who had hugged Sierra in her driveway just hours before was now pretending he barely knew her daughter. That was the moment Sierra Milton knew something was terribly, horrifically wrong. Zion Foster wasn't perfect. Her mother would be the first to admit that. At 16, she'd tested boundaries like most teenagers do. She'd argued with Sierra about curfews and rules, threatened to run away, and twice actually followed through on those threats. The first time, she'd gone to her grandmother's house, frustrated and seeking independence. The second time, Sierra had been worried enough to call the police. But both times, Zion came home. She always came home. That history became a weapon against Sierra the moment she walked into the East Point Police Department on January 5, 2022. Officers looked at her missing persons report with skepticism etched across their faces. One officer didn't mince words. He told Sierra bluntly that her daughter was a known runaway, and they weren't going to treat this as an urgent case. They'd seen it before. Teenage girl, history of leaving home, probably shacked up somewhere with a boyfriend. She'd come back when she was ready. But Sierra knew this was different. Zion had been working steady shifts at the Detroit Wing Company. She was excited about prom. She had plans to get her own apartment. She was talking about her future, not running from it. And most importantly, Zion had told her mother exactly where she was going that night. Sierra left the police station feeling helpless and furious. If law enforcement wasn't going to help her find Zion, she'd do it herself. She rallied family and friends, printed hundreds of flyers, and plastered them across Detroit neighborhoods. She organized search parties and spoke to local news stations, pleading for anyone who had seen her daughter to come forward. "We need your eyes," she told reporters. "The police need your help." Meanwhile, boyfriend Bertez Gonzalez wasn't buying Jaylen's story either. He'd been tracking Zion's location on her phone the night she disappeared, something he admitted he did regularly because he was a little insecure in their relationship. At 11:24 p.m. on January 4, Zion's phone pinged directly across the street from Jaylen's house. Vertez had taken a screenshot. He had proof. When Vertez confronted Jaylen with the evidence, Jaylen sent back a video from his Ring doorbell camera. "See?" he said. "She never came here. But something felt off." Sierra watched the footage herself and noticed gaps in the timestamps. Entries were missing. Footage had been deleted. Jaylen claimed Zion was lying about spending time with him, that she'd been sneaky and using his name as a cover to see someone else, maybe a neighbor down the street. He even suggested Sierra should go to the police, but asked to be kept out of it. It didn't make sense. Sierra had watched Jaylen pick Zion up from their driveway dozens of times. She'd hugged him herself. How could he claim they hadn't spoken in years? Neighbor surveillance cameras never blink. They record silently, capturing moments that people would rather keep hidden. In this case, a Ring doorbell camera mounted across the street from Jaylen Brazier's East Point home captured something that would blow his lies wide open. At 11:15 p.m. on January 4, 2022, a white sedan pulled into Jaylen's driveway. Two people got out and walked toward the front door. One was clearly male. The other was female. Moments earlier, Jaylen had dropped his girlfriend Katrina Smith off at her midnight shift at a local manufacturing plant. She worked from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., a grueling overnight schedule that left Jaylen alone in the house with their two young sons. The woman walking into Jaylen's house at 11:15 couldn't have been Katrina. Phone location data later confirmed what investigators already suspected. The second person entering that home was Zion Foster. The camera angle captured her clearly enough. She was there. She went inside. And she was never seen leaving. For the next 2.5 hours, there's only silence. No footage of Zion walking out the front door. No video of her getting back into the car. Nothing. Then, at 1:41 a.m., the same neighbor's camera recorded something strange. Jaylen's white sedan pulled out of the driveway slowly, then reversed back in. This time, the trunk faced toward the backyard, deliberately positioned away from the street. Away from the camera's view. A few minutes passed. Then the car drove off into the night. It returned less than 10 minutes later and parked normally in the driveway. By that time, Zion's phone had already gone dark. At 1:15 a.m., her device disconnected from the cellular network. That was the exact moment she stopped replying to Vertez's messages. The exact moment her digital footprint vanished. Inside the house that night, Jaylen's two toddler sons slept upstairs, unaware of whatever was unfolding below them. What happened between 11:15 p.m. and 1:41 a.m.? What occurred in those hours that caused a 17-year-old girl to disappear without a trace? Only two people know the answer to that question. One of them is Zion Foster, and she's gone. The other is Jaylen Brazier, and he wasn't talking. For days, Jaylen Brazier stuck to his story. He hadn't seen Zion. She was never at his house. The Ring camera proved it, he said. But the neighbor's footage told a different story, and investigators weren't buying his lies anymore. On January 13, 2022, search warrants were executed on both Jaylen's home and his white sedan. Detectives combed through every room of the house. They checked closets, searched the basement, examined the backyard. They were looking for anything that might indicate Zion had been there. Clothing fibers. Blood. Hair. A phone. Anything. But the search came up empty. The house had been cleaned thoroughly. If Zion had been there, someone had worked hard to erase every trace of her presence. The car was next. Investigators meticulously catalogued the contents of Jaylen's sedan. They photographed the interior, swabbed surfaces for DNA, and examined the trunk with forensic precision. On the surface, nothing appeared suspicious. No visible bloodstains. No obvious signs of a struggle. But investigators knew that some evidence can't be seen with the naked eye. That's when they brought in the cadaver dogs. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, even in trace amounts that might be invisible or cleaned away. When the dogs were brought to Jaylen's vehicle, their reaction was immediate and unmistakable. They alerted on the trunk. The signal was clear. A dead body had been in that trunk. It was the break investigators desperately needed. Armed with this evidence, detectives reached out to Jaylen again. This time, the 23-year-old showed up at the police station on January 19 with a friend who happened to be a lawyer. He knew the walls were closing in. The lies couldn't hold anymore. It was time to tell a new version of the truth, or at least something closer to it. Jaylen sat down across from detectives and finally admitted what everyone already knew. Yes, Zion had been at his house that night. He'd picked her up from her home just before 11 p.m. and brought her back to his place. They hung out in the living room after he put his two young sons to bed. They smoked marijuana together. They talked about normal teenage stuff, her relationship with her mom, her boyfriend Vertez, prom plans, her job at the Wing restaurant, her dreams of getting her own apartment someday. Everything was fine, he said. Totally normal. Until it wasn't. When Sierra Milton handed over Zion's old cell phone to investigators, she had no idea what they would find. The device had been replaced months earlier, but Zion had kept it at home, stored away with all her old messages still intact. What detectives discovered on that phone was nothing short of horrifying. Over 4,000 text messages between Zion and Jaylen Brazier were recovered. 4,000. The sheer volume was staggering, but it was the content that made investigators' stomachs turn. These weren't casual check-ins between distant cousins. These were calculated, predatory messages that spanned months, possibly years. Jaylen had been grooming Zion right under everyone's noses. I need to pause here for a moment because this next part is disturbing. If you're someone who values truth and wants to help shine a light on these kinds of cases, I need you to do something. Hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to show this story to more people, and that matters. These stories deserve to be heard. The messages started subtly. Compliments about how smart she was, how mature she seemed for her age, how easy she was to talk to. Then they escalated. Jaylen would tell Zion that other people thought they looked like a couple. He'd say Katrina was jealous of how much time he wanted to spend with her. He'd invite her over repeatedly, always when Katrina was at work, always when the house was empty except for his sleeping children. He offered to let Zion stay in his basement if she ever ran away again. He gave her advice on how to avoid police if she left home. He called himself a god when it came to attracting women, building himself up in her eyes as someone powerful, someone she should admire. The messages grew more inappropriate over time, crossing lines that should never be crossed between a 23-year-old man and a teenage girl who called him family. Wayne County Assistant Prosecutor Ryan Elsey would later describe the texts as pervasive and predatory. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a pattern. Jaylen had been carefully constructing a relationship with Zion that went far beyond what any reasonable person would consider normal between cousins. He was building trust, breaking down boundaries, and positioning himself as someone she could rely on, someone she could confide in, someone she might eventually see as more than family. But the text messages were only part of the picture. Investigators also recovered Jaylen's search history from cloud storage, despite his attempt to wipe his phone clean with a factory reset on January 7. In the months leading up to Zion's disappearance, Jaylen had repeatedly searched for pornographic content using specific terms, cousin and step-cousin. Some of the videos he accessed were described in court documents as violent and graphic in nature. Jaylen Brazier couldn't keep his story straight. Every time he opened his mouth, a different version of events spilled out. It started with a flat denial. He hadn't seen Zion in years. She was lying about spending time with him. Then, when surveillance footage proved she'd been at his house, he admitted she was there but claimed she just died. Unexpectedly. Tragically. Nothing he could do about it. In his first confession on January 19, Jaylen told detectives they'd smoked marijuana together that night. Zion got sleepy, laid her head back on the couch, and drifted off. He went to pour himself a drink. When he came back 15 to 20 minutes later, she wasn't responding. He checked her pulse. It was faint. Her heartbeat grew weaker. Then it stopped completely. She was dead, just like that, he said. A 17-year-old girl in perfect health had simply stopped breathing after smoking a little weed. The next day, January 20th, Jaylen changed his story. Now it wasn't just marijuana. They'd taken acid together. LSD. That must have been what killed her, he suggested. The psychedelics hit her wrong, stopped her heart somehow. Detectives pushed harder, trying to get him to admit he'd done something to Zion while under the influence, something he couldn't fully remember or control. But Jaylen didn't take the bait. He stuck to this new version. The acid killed her. Not him. Months later, in June, Jaylen recanted the LSD story entirely. He told investigators he'd made it up because he felt pressured to give them more details. Now he was back to the marijuana explanation. She smoked weed, fell asleep, and never woke up. That was it. That was the truth this time. Detectives didn't know which version to believe, if any. Throughout his 9 months in custody on a charge of lying to police, Jaylen made frequent phone calls home to Katrina and other family members. Every single call was monitored and recorded. He tried to be careful with his words, but his anxiety bled through. Sometimes he used another inmate's calling code, thinking it would keep his conversations private. It didn't. He also had a prohibited cell phone smuggled into his cell, which he used to send thousands of messages to Katrina. In nearly every conversation, Jaylen asked the same question in various forms. Anything major happen? Any news? Any updates? He wanted to know if the massive landfill search launched by Detroit police had found anything. Or anyone. When he learned the searches were coming up empty week after week, his relief was palpable. Before we continue with this heartbreaking search, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love knowing where our community is tuning in from, and it helps us understand how far these stories reach. Finding a body in a landfill is like searching for a single grain of sand on an entire beach. It's nearly impossible, but Detroit police were determined to try. Garbage trucks that serviced the Highland Park area in the days following Zion's disappearance were tracked meticulously. Investigators identified which trucks had picked up from the dumpsters where Jaylen claimed he'd left Zion's body, and they traced those trucks to specific zones within local landfills across the Detroit metropolitan area. What followed was one of the most extensive and heartbreaking searches in recent Michigan history. Over 70 volunteers, most wearing hazmat suits and face masks, gathered at the landfill sites ready to do the unthinkable. They would dig through mountains of trash, layer by layer, searching for any trace of a 17-year-old girl who'd been thrown away like garbage. The conditions were brutal. The stench of decomposing waste was overwhelming, even through masks. Volunteers sifted through household trash, rotting food, industrial refuse, and medical waste under the scorching sun and through freezing rain. Heavy machinery moved massive piles of debris so searchers could examine what lay beneath. Every bag had to be opened. Every layer had to be checked. It was exhausting, disgusting, and emotionally devastating work. The search was initially estimated to take about 8 weeks. It stretched to nearly 6 months. Detroit Police Department spokesperson issued statements trying to manage expectations while keeping hope alive. "We're doing what's right for the right reasons," they told the media. We're going to do everything we possibly can to bring some degree of closure to this family. But as weeks turned into months, that closure seemed more and more unlikely. Sierra Milton visited the landfill sites regularly, standing at the perimeter and watching volunteers dig through the trash that had swallowed her daughter. She brought them water and snacks. She thanked them for not giving up. But deep down, she knew the odds. Jaylen had disposed of Zion's body more than 2 weeks before the search began. In that time, garbage trucks had compacted loads over and over, crushing everything inside into dense, unrecognizable masses. Zion could be anywhere. She could be in pieces. She could be buried under 50 feet of trash. By mid-2022, the search was officially called off. Zion Foster's body was never found. There would be no grave for her family to visit. No funeral where they could say goodbye properly. No closure, just an endless, aching absence. For Sierra, it was a pain that would never fully heal. On June 13, 2023, a year and a half after Zion Foster vanished, Detroit police finally secured the warrant they'd been building toward. Jaylen Brazier was about to be charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. His brief taste of freedom was over. Body camera footage captured the moment officers pulled him over. Jaylen sat calmly in the driver's seat as an officer approached his window. "You know why we're here, man," the officer said. Jaylen's face remained blank, almost resigned, as if he'd been expecting this day to come eventually. He handed over his license without protest. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs. Upon his arrest, 2 additional cell phones were seized from Jaylen's possession. Even after serving 9 months for lying to police, he was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to stay one step ahead of investigators. But the digital evidence had already sealed his fate. Despite factory resetting his phone on January 7, just 3 days after disposing of Zion's body, Jaylen's search history had been preserved in cloud storage. Investigators recovered every single query he'd made in the days following her death. The searches painted a damning picture of a man desperately trying to cover up a crime. Are garbage trucks also compactors? What is the force of a garbage truck compactor? How do police get your phone history? How do you know if police are watching you? These weren't the searches of an innocent man who'd panicked after a tragic accident. These were the searches of someone calculating his next moves, trying to understand whether evidence could still exist, whether he'd be caught. But the most disturbing searches had been made months before Zion's disappearance. In the weeks and months leading up to January 4, Jaylen had repeatedly searched for pornographic content using specific terms, cousin and step-cousin. Forensic experts didn't just find the search terms. They retrieved the actual video results he'd clicked on and watched. Many were described in court documents as violent and graphic in nature. At a preliminary hearing, prosecutors laid out their theory in stark detail. Jaylen Brazier had been grooming Zion Foster for years, building a relationship that crossed every moral and legal boundary. On January 4, just hours after learning his girlfriend Katrina was pregnant with their 3rd child, he acted on the obsession he'd been nurturing in secret. What exactly happened inside that house between 11:15 p.m. and 1:15 a.m. remains known only to Jaylen. But the evidence suggested violence. When Katrina got into his car at nearly 3 a.m. that morning, she immediately noticed a deep scratch across his collarbone. Fresh. Deep enough to draw blood. Jaylen blamed the cat. But the cat had never scratched him like that before. In May 2024, Jaylen Brazier's trial began at the Wayne County Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed with Zion's family, members of the media, and community members who had followed this case for over 2 years. Sierra Milton sat in the front row every single day, her eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed her family. If you're still with me at this point, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you think justice needs to be served in cases like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Case Files Collective so you can stay updated on true crime cases that matter. Your support means everything. The trial lasted 2 full weeks. Prosecutors called 32 witnesses to the stand. The defense called none. Jaylen Brazier chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. It was a strategic decision, but one that spoke volumes to the jury. If his story was true, if Zion really had died accidentally from a seizure or a bad reaction to drugs, why wouldn't he take the stand and explain himself? Wayne County Assistant Prosecutor Ryan Elsey presented the state's case methodically. It was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, but the pieces fit together with devastating clarity. Surveillance footage showed Zion entering Jaylen's house at 11:15 p.m. and never leaving. Phone records proved her device went offline at 1:15 a.m., the exact moment she stopped responding to Vertez. Cell tower data placed Jaylen at the Highland Park dumpsters at 1:48 a.m. Cadaver dogs had alerted on his trunk. Over 4,000 grooming texts had been recovered. His search history revealed an obsession with cousin-themed pornography, some of it violent. And then there were his lies. So many lies. Each one more desperate than the last. First he claimed he hadn't seen Zion in years. Then he admitted she was there but said she died from smoking marijuana. Then it was LSD. Then he took back the LSD story. Every time investigators pressed him, the story changed. Innocent people don't lie like that. Innocent people don't factory reset their phones 3 days after someone dies. Innocent people don't search how do police get your phone history. The prosecution's theory was clear and chilling. Jaylen had been grooming Zion for years, building trust and breaking down boundaries. On January 4th, he picked her up late at night while his girlfriend was conveniently at work and his children were asleep. He had the house to himself. He had opportunity. And according to prosecutors, he had motive. Just hours earlier, he'd learned Katrina was pregnant with their third child. Maybe that news triggered something. Maybe he felt trapped. Maybe he saw Zion as an escape, a fantasy he'd been nurturing for months or even years. And when things didn't go the way he wanted, when Zion rejected him or fought back, he killed her. The defense tried to offer an alternative explanation. They pointed to testimony from Vertez, who said Zion had once told him she suffered from seizures and took medication. The jury deliberated for just 30 minutes. In a trial that had lasted 2 weeks, with 32 witnesses and mountains of evidence, it took them less time than a lunch break to reach a verdict. When the foreperson stood and announced the decision, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty. Guilty on both counts. Second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Sierra Milton collapsed into the arms of family members, sobbing. It wasn't relief. It wasn't celebration. It was exhaustion mixed with grief mixed with a tiny sliver of validation. The system had worked. A jury of 12 strangers had seen through Jaylen's lies and recognized the truth. Her daughter had been murdered, and the man responsible would finally be held accountable. But Jaylen Brazier wasn't done performing. At his sentencing hearing weeks later, he maintained his innocence with the same calm, detached tone he'd used throughout the entire ordeal. Zion was not violated in any way, he told the court. She was not hurt at all. He insisted that he'd tried to apologize, that he'd never wanted any of this to happen, that everyone had misunderstood him from the beginning. Judge Donald Knapp wasn't buying it. Before announcing the sentence, the judge took several minutes to outline everything Jaylen had done wrong. He had failed to accept responsibility for the murder. He had failed to show remorse for disposing of Zion's body like trash. He had lied to police repeatedly, wasting valuable time and resources. He had caused immeasurable pain to Zion's family, dragging them through years of uncertainty and anguish. He had left his 2 young children alone in the house while he committed a violent crime. He had manipulated everyone around him, including his own girlfriend. It is unlikely you will ever be rehabilitated, Judge Knapp said. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. Jaylen Brazier was sentenced to 30 to 90 years in prison for second-degree murder, plus an additional 5 to 10 years for tampering with evidence, to be served consecutively. He will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Outside the courthouse, Sierra Milton spoke through tears. "My body was trembling," she said, "but when that verdict was read, I was so happy. She was loved. She is loved. She was fought for." Then she turned her attention directly to Jaylen. "You thought you were smart. You tried to be slick. The people saw you for what you are. I hope you never get out. But justice is not closure. Zion Foster's body has never been recovered. There is no grave where Sierra can lay flowers. No headstone. No final resting place. Zion remains lost somewhere in a Detroit landfill, discarded as if her life meant nothing." What's the weather like where you are today? Take a moment after this video and step outside. Feel the sun or rain or wind. Zion Foster will never feel those things again. Her life was stolen at 17 by someone she trusted. If this case moved you, please share this video. As of 2025, Jaylen Brazier remains incarcerated. Zion's family continues to honor her memory and advocate for missing persons cases. Make sure you're subscribed to the Case Files Collective and let me know what case you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, stay safe and never stop seeking the truth.